Hi, my name is Kalyn. I'm going to visit with you today about calving ease, kind of some of the science behind the things that influence calving ease. I work for the University of Florida. I'm a county extension director in the Panhandle of Florida. And really, whether you're in South Florida or out across the Midwest, calving ease is something that cattle producers are going to focus on. It's really critical to the success of our herd for a lot of different reasons, and one of them being that 70% of calf loss that we're going to experience in our herd is going to take place within the first 24 hours of birth. And most oftentimes when we see calf loss within the first 24 hours of birth, aside from weather and different things like that, it can often be associated with having calving problems. So whether that's going to be a hard pull, a cesarean, different things like that, we can see a lot of calf loss from different things. And not only do we see an increase in calf death rate due to dystocia, we see that in two different studies that come from Clay Center in Nebraska, but we also see that impact our cow's ability to become pregnant for the subsequent breeding season. So we're going to see cows that are going to have delayed rebreedings, and obviously when you get paid per pound, and we're talking about, 21-day calving or 21-day estrus cycle, every time that those cows miss or have a prolonged postpartum interval, we're really going to see that affect our bottom line. So in some studies that are highlighted here on this slide, we can see that a delayed in rebreeding in cows that were bred to AI that had calving issues versus cows that had unassisted births, that there was a significant increase in the number of cows that become pregnant to AI, and then again, overall, the number of cows that were getting pregnant. So not only are we seeing calf loss and that affecting our bottom line, but we're also seeing that impact come into our cow's ability to rebreed. So there's a ton of different factors that affect calving ease and affect that cow's ability to have an unassisted birth. Genetics, temperature, nutritional plane, sex, position of the calf obviously plays into role, breed, and then just the phenotype or the build of that mother and the sire. So a lot of things play into role. We're going to just look at a few of these factors today. So birth weight obviously is the most highly heritable trait, or the most highly correlated trait, not heritable, to that calf's issue with calving ease, and we see that there's breed effects that play into that, or those genetics. And so there's some other factors. So the traits on this slide here that are negatively correlated, when you see a negative correlation, that means as one goes up, the other comes down. So we see things like calf sex and pelvic area. Obviously, as pelvic area goes down, your incidence of calving difficulty are going to go up. Gestation length, we see that a longer gestation will typically cause some calving issues. So there's a lot of different things that play into dystocia. We're pretty familiar with genetics. I think that the cattle industry as a whole has done a really good job of addressing some of these issues and how they play into calving ease, because it's a fairly critical thing. So we see some breeds that have really minimized the impact of calving difficulties. And then we see some other breeds that still struggle in certain areas. And so genetics definitely play into that. There's some really great expected progeny differences, or EPDs, that we can utilize. One thing that's really important to always keep in mind is birth weight is just one factor. So you look at the birth weight EPD, but then you're also going to want to look at the calving ease direct EPD. And that is going to play into those cows' ability to have unassisted births from that particular sire. And that EPD is just a calculation of the percentage of unassisted births that are above breed average. So a common misconception or question that we're going to get a lot of times is, can you feed a cow enough to cause issues with birth weight? And that answer is kind of difficult to explain, and I'll show you more about that. So in general, when we think about overfeeding or underfeeding our cows, in some instances people believe that if you restrict your diet towards the end of gestation, that you can help minimize some of that calf's weight gain and help decrease the incidence of assisted births. When you look at some of the data, this is some classical data that comes from 1978, and we can see that what they did is they took cows and they fed them either on a high plane of nutrition or they fed them on a lower plane of nutrition. So those cows were either getting 13.9 pounds of TDN, or else the second group were receiving 7.5 pounds of TDN. So just to kind of help you wrap your mind around a little bit about how much feed that is. So if you think about it in terms of corn gluten feed, that's something pretty commonly supplemented in the cattle industry. Corn gluten feed is about 80% TDN. So for those high plane of nutrition cows, that's going to be about 17.5 pounds of TDN, and then, 17.5 pounds of corn gluten feed, and then the lower cows are going to be getting about 9.5 pounds of that corn gluten feed as their energy supplement over their gestation. And then just to kind of quantify that, a 5-gallon bucket of corn gluten feed is going to weigh about 25 pounds, depending on, give or take a few pounds. So that'll kind of help you wrap your mind around how much these cows were being supplemented. So they broke these cows into 2 groups, and then they also broke them down by sex, because we know sex is going to play into this a little bit. And we can actually see there wasn't a tremendous amount of difference as far as birth weight goes, whether or not those cows were receiving a high level of supplementation versus a low level of supplementation. So they really didn't alter the birth weight of those calves when they doubled the energy intake. But what's even more important to keep in mind is when some research came out of Clay Center, Nebraska, when we look at the dystocia levels or the calving difficulties, when we start to restrict that feed intake, especially in our young cows, this research was done in 2-year-old cows, we can see that you're actually going to increase your incidence of calving difficulty if your cows are thin and weak. And so if we don't supplement our cows in hopes that we're going to reduce that calf birth weight, we're actually might kind of have a negative effect where we're going to see some of those thinner cows. They might have a little bit lighter calves, but they're going to have tremendously more assisted births, just for the simple fact that those cows just are a little bit weaker going into the calving season. And we definitely don't want that, because we also know how that plays into those cows' ability to rebreed. So long story short, on the nutrition side of things, if you really overfeed your cows to the point where, you're getting up into that body condition score 7s above, things like that, you'll start to see some calving difficulties. But your best bet is to supplement your cows to meet the requirements. Do not restrict feed in the last section of gestation, because you're going to have a negative effect on those cows' abilities to have an unassisted birth. Something a little more interesting that we sometimes don't think about playing into calving difficulties or birth weight is temperature. So I know out west this year, y'all have had a rough year. I think it's still a rough year. Y'all are getting ready to go into calving season, and I know there's still snow on the ground, and where there's not snow, there's mud. But one thing you can think about is either, if you calve in the spring, so you've just come out of winter, or if you calve in the fall, you've just come out of summer. So the last third of gestation has either been in extreme heat or extreme cold. We alter the blood flow patterns to that fetus. So when it's cold, the cow or the maternal unit is going to internalize the blood flow a little more. And then when it's hot, obviously the blood flow is going to go externally. So you're going to have less nutrient flow to that fetus. So overall, when you think about blood flow or temperature affecting calving difficulty because of increased birth weight, typically for every 1 degree above average you are for that season, you're going to see a 1 pound increase in birth weight. Another thing that plays into that is going to be calf sex. When we look at the calf sex, we can obviously have it be logical that the males are typically going to be born a little bit earlier or a little bit heavier than the females. And so that comes into play a little bit. Typically in dystocia, you're going to have a few more issues with your male calves than your female calves. And they're typically going to weigh 5 to 8% more than your heifer calves when they're born. And a lot of this has to do with the fact is that that male fetus is going to start being influenced by testosterone about 45 days into gestation. And so they're already getting those bumps from that hormone that's going to cause a little bit increased growth. Not going to see a tremendous amount of difference in this, but it's just something that you might observe. So overall, when we think about calving ease, I think a lot of focus gets put on bull selection. Obviously it should, but there's a few other management tools or strategies that should be taken into play. Besides genetics, it's very difficult to influence the birth weight of your calves. And so if you don't get it right up front when you're selecting bulls, restricting nutrition in the last third of gestation, herd management, those types of things that make it really have very minimal effects. So we want to make sure that we're selecting good bulls. We're making sure we're putting heifer or calving these bulls on our younger or smaller framed heifers so that we can make sure that we try to eliminate some of the issues there. And then, you know, you have some minor impacts from environmental factors at all. So overall, I think that calving ease is something that's fairly managed in the cattle industry, but we got to stay on top of it, especially when you're calving young cows and heifers, because economically it can have a pretty big impact. And then in addition, you know, if you're calving heifers, it can be a nightmare if you're pulling a bunch of calves and kind of having a train wreck. So do our homework, stay on top of it, and we can really start to see some improvements in our herd's calving ease numbers and number of unassisted births. So with that, I'm going to conclude. If y'all have any questions, please feel free to give me a call. My contact information is on the slide, and hope everyone has a successful calving season.